Hi, Shomik. Well, welcome to Venture with Grace today.
Hi, Grace. Thanks so much for having me on. And I've been a big fan of many of the other guests that you've had on, including I saw Dan from Decibel, who's a close friend. So excited to follow in his footsteps and maybe see if I can beat his numbers. So
Oh my God. I love a good, healthy competition going on with friends. Anyway, okay. Let's start with why don't we start with your journey. You have a really interesting career. You have worked and you have like experienced IPOs, acquisitions, and a failed startup. I love that. Like you have the boldness to put it on the resume. Let's chat about before venture, what were you doing and how did it kind of shape you into who you are today?
Yeah, so grew up on the East Coast. At the time, I was always interested in companies and kind of investing from just like a little age. My first stock I bought was Kellogg, and and it just came from Frosted Flakes, right? Like I liked it. I was like, hey, it's everywhere, and then went from there. And so I think that was something I was always kind of something I was interested in. I thought I was going to go the hedge fund route, and ironically, like after I went to school, I was kind of doing fixed income trading, sales and trading, and Facebook had IPO'd. I was trying to understand how people are valuing the business, and I thought the best way to do that was to go into tech M&A, and frankly come out to the Bay Area to learn more. And so then that's what led me to sort of come out to San Francisco, did investment banking for a year, and then I went to a venture debt fund. And again, I didn't know what venture debt was. Like I didn't even know what startups were. It just so happened that basically I was going to go join a hedge fund, and one was saying, "Hey, would you like to study 5 companies a year?" And the other was saying, "Would you like to study 500?" And my ADHD was like, 500 sounds a lot more fun than five. And so ironically, like as much as I think others have like this clear, defined path and this way in, mine was very random, kind of just happenstance, chance, things like that. And so from venture debt, I then joined a startup as the first employee. As I mentioned, that didn't go quite the way we'd hoped. And then I went to the growth stage side at a fund called Top Tier Capital, and then that's actually kind of where I met the boldstart team, where I've been now for the past close to 5 years. And happy to talk more about what we do at boldstart, but that's kind of my journey.
Amazing. I feel like on other podcasts, I heard a lot about you were talking about Shopify. You were talking about like basically how that kind of you to basically, I think you mentioned about to understand SaaS software, you should probably study closely or chat with people who are at Salesforce to understand the entire pipeline of the funnel. So since like many of our listeners probably haven't chat with people at Salesforce, why don't we start with like, can you give us like the overall broader view on like how is it like investing in SaaS companies and how does the money flow and essentially what goes into it in each step of the way to kind of like within the pipeline or
Yeah.
just like how it works.
Yeah, I mean, so first I would say just kind of why did I pick enterprise software, something that I was excited about. And ironically, like again, if you think about from a young age, like I was always interested in investing and business models. I was really attracted to the mission criticality of a lot of enterprise software. And so Salesforce is a system of record, right? Oracle as a database company has been around for a long time, and so like all these things were something that I was quite interested in, and that's what actually led me to my interest. And that's kind of how I started. And so what you're referring to is kind of my evolution. When you go from buying Kellogg to then like studying Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett and learning about capital allocation. Then you go into maybe Constellation Software, where it's Mark Leonard who's rolling up vertical market software businesses, and you start to be like that's an interesting kind of business, and then you start to kind of go from there and there. And so what I say about Salesforce is I think it's one of the most interesting businesses to learn how distribution is a core advantage to that company. And so if you ask a lot of people, is Salesforce product the best? In fact, many people might say no. It's actually maybe not the
Mhm.
best, right? It could people don't really like it that much. And so then the question is like, well, then why is it still performing so well, and why is it still doing it? And it's because they built out this incredible distribution engine, and it's evolved over time, right? It used to actually be, ironically, like we talk about PLG now, like Salesforce was one of the early PLG type use cases where actually it was getting adopted by teams and individual users quite efficiently. And then they moved into this enterprise motion. And now what's happened is as they moved into enterprises, they started to have these, kind of SIs, consultancies, right, that were going and implementing Salesforce in different customers. Well, that's awesome, but you don't necessarily control that distribution channel, right? You're still relying on Accenture, Deloitte, whoever to implement the product, and timelines could vary, like how long that takes, what the data model looks like just all sorts of things could be varied based on how they do things. And so what's been interesting to Salesforce actually recently is like they've actually started acquiring some of those SIs, some of those system integrators themselves, those consultancies themselves, and building that out internally so they can own this distribution. And I think that's something that's so fascinating because again, you go to Kellogg cereal, like the placement in the grocery store is how distribution matters. Like that's you go and buy whatever's eye level, right? And that same thing goes for software. It's like if you can be in front of those buyers, in front of the CIOs, the CTOs, the whoever's that are buying your product, it's just the same thing, getting distribution out there.
I wonder like if a company who is like trying to create like the multi-level distribution channel for themselves, what do you think they should work on to kind of like establish like a system for themselves in the SaaS ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, so enterprise software in general is quite broad. So SaaS versus security versus kind of software infrastructure, like those can all have different motions, and especially maybe this is where like at boldstart, like what we focus on is the earliest stage of company building, right? So we partner with companies with founders at inception, and we basically help them hopefully build their companies from the pre-product stage and as they scale. And so at that stage, right, a SaaS company's distribution looks very different than a security company because in many cases, a security company, unless it can truly just affect one person, security sometimes affects from the beginning more whole orgs. And so that necessitates a different go-to-market motion. So when you set up your distribution, you have to take into account that, hey, multi-level stakeholders might be involved to roll this product out. And so like the amount that needs to be built, and the audits and the controls you need to have in place and the access control and all that sort of stuff is almost a little bit more heavier of a product that you need to kind of get out there into the world. Besides when you have the SaaS stuff, which is like, this podcasting platform that we're using now, right? Like you can kind of ship something out there that just solves like a really narrow pain point. It doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles. It doesn't have to have all the different connections and everything. And people can still start using it as an individual user. And then you can start to grow from there over time. And so like to answer the question, it kind of depends on what your model is. If you're application software, which we call SaaS, if you're kind of software infrastructure, which could be, whether it's a developer tool or more of a like kind of a org-wide level technology rollout. And then there's kind of security, which is typically much more of affecting everybody in the organization.
I wonder when it comes to like picking what companies that you're investing in, how do you come up with like a thesis? And I wonder in the space of like SaaS security and um, any type of like enterprise software, I think it's super hard to back company that are like started very, very early on, like you mentioned, like the first line of code. What are some factors that you feel like are good indicators like this company is a good company? Besides, we've heard of like the market is number one and then the team, but I feel like when it comes down to the market and the team, there's a lot of different smaller benchmark that people may leverage to evaluate the company. I would love to hear about your benchmark.
Yeah, so I would say like what's funny is if you ask some of my colleagues too, like they may have different answers to this question. So the answer is like it can be different for everybody. It's just kind of playing to your strengths. I would say like in general, like at this earliest stage, I think without a doubt, people is the most important thing. Now, Within that context, though, like you kind of have to have an understanding that the market's going to be big enough. Because even if you have, Warren Buffett has a quote that's essentially just like, if you have a great team and a terrible market, right? The unfortunately the market usually wins, and that's like one of these scenarios where you still need to be thoughtful about the market. But the interesting thing about judging a market from the beginning is that they will all look very very small. And like our I think our favorite example at boldstart is one of our largest companies currently is a company called Sneak. And now their last round was 7.4 billion or something like that. The company's doing very well in the security space. But when they started, right, with three co-founders, just kind of building the product, they started very narrow. And if anybody looked at what they were doing, right, where they were saying, "Hey, Node.js developers, you should care about open source security." Think about like it's open source security. Two, it's Node.js developers. Like they are just limiting the market more and more and more, right? And it's a little bit strange to be like, well, how is that going to be a big market? Like if you said is this going to be a $7.4 billion company one day? You kind of have to be crazy to say yes, right? But the founders are the ones who can say, okay, no, we're going to get this niche group of people to really, really care about this. And oh, guess what? Then they're going to start rolling out to the rest of the JavaScript community, the rest of the Python community, and so on and so forth, right? And as that starts to expand, oh, by the way, then we'll start to move into the adjacent products that exist alongside of us, and then start to build out a full end-to-end security platform over time, right? But like, it really comes from having founders who understand that pain point, who can kind of give you the high level excitement around, hey, here's how we're going to evangelize this market, here's how we're going to change things, but then drill down really really nitty ditty gritty into the details of here's the specific product that we're going to build in the first 3 months, and here's the type of design partners that we want based on the experience that we want them to have and the learnings that we want to get from that. And once you get those together, you get like a really really exciting combo for something that we can at least be excited about the potential for. And then of course there's a lot of execution stuff that happens in between there and the rest of the journey.
Totally. Let's use like maybe Sneak as an example. I also saw that you're a board member of a company that's sold to Sneak. And I wonder, when you're recognizing these companies, can you give us like a general picture of like, since like AI is like a really big factor in the SaaS like improvement ecosystem. So like, I know that you talk about Pinecone in another podcast. You talk about other companies, or like you chat with like people from NVIDIA on your own podcast. What are some lessons that you've learned from the industry experts? And then where do you see it's like a really cool white space to look at when it comes to investing right now?
Yeah. So a couple different things I would kind of talk about there. I guess one, we're learning from industry experts all the time, and so that's like kind of where we see the future is, one, from the founders, but also two, from very smart whether it's CIOs, CISOs, security leaders, heads of engineering, kind of different folks at different areas. They kind of almost show us the way forward because they'll be talking about their pain points, and as they do that, we'll start to ask them questions around like, okay, like why is that occurring? Like why is that such a big deal, right? And then we're starting to learn a lot about the market. So constantly those sort of experts that we talk to are always like compounding our knowledge of the market, and then of the specific wedge at which maybe we could approach this market with to then build something out much bigger than that. In terms of white space, I think there's frankly like so much area of excitement. So in general, what I would say is that I would for founders listening, right, I would look for not what is the hottest today. Like, I'll give you a good example. There's a company called Mosaic ML that got bought by Databricks, and after that acquisition, we saw probably 10 to 20 super smart founders all being like, hey, we're building Mosaic ML. And it's just like, and they have some differentiation. So it's not to say that there wasn't there, but it was just like, this company just got acquired. That's great. But now, like, just because Airbnb is doing well, don't everyone now go and build Airbnb, right? You have to kind of figure out what's your next version of Airbnb, right? Like what's
Mhm.
your, in when nobody cares about that market, or and no one understands what it's looking like. And so that's the main thing I would say is for a lot of folks out there right now, they're looking at AI and foundation models and all this sort of stuff. And ironically, like the frontier of where we're going to go in the next, who knows a time frame, but let's call it, even a year, is probably something more agent based, right? Where we're going to have these autonomous AI agents running through tasks and doing things on behalf of us. And so, kind of skip the stage of trying to figure out, like, are you supposed to use Mistral? Are you supposed to use Llama? Are you supposed to use whatever? It doesn't matter. Start building for the world that you believe is going to happen in the future, and build it now. So then when that kind of adoption curve starts to happen, you're the first there to be able to do that. And I'll give another example from our portfolio. There's a company called Protect AI, and Protect AI started. I forget exactly, but like let's call it. I think it was like 1.5 years before ChatGPT came out.
Mhm.
And what was interesting is at the time we weren't quite sure when people would care about AI models as a new attack surface. And we sort of were just like, this is a really smart team, a great group of founders. They have like a clear approach as to how they're going to start to evangelize the product while they wait for the market. And then we basically were just like, okay, well, I guess like 3 years from now we'll figure out if the market kind of realizes the pain points around here. Well, it just so happens that again, if you go early and you prepare, sometimes you get lucky, and it happened a lot sooner than we thought in terms
Mhm.
of the market switching in that direction. So that's sort of this category creation framework, right? If you're going to do that, you want to be ahead of the market, and you're taking risk, by the way, inherently in that, because maybe the market doesn't come your way. But when it does, you're the one who've been building out ahead of the market for a much longer time period, and then you can kind of use those advantages now to build your business in a much more, kind of quicker and efficient manner.
Um, I I really liked what you said about like, essentially you have to find out what's gonna be hot in like the next 3 years instead of like what's hot like that's just got bought. So I wonder when you're thinking about what's gonna happen in the next 3 years. Um, I know you said this on like somewhere else that's like, AI is you're bullish on AI in the long term, but like in the short term, I wonder what are some opportunities that you feel like in your specific domain that's like really exciting for you.
So I think like for sure, we already kind of talked about it a little bit, but AI and security, there's a whole different bunch of angles there. I mean, just as much as we talk about the security tools on the defensive side, having LLMs and AI baked into them. Unfortunately, so do there's the offensive side, right, and the kind of threat actors, and so that's this balance of we need to continue to improve the defensive side of things so that we can continue to stay out ahead of kind of the offensive side. And so there's a ton of areas. Security is a very large space, and so like all of those are going to be affected by AI in the coming kind of I would even say a shorter time frame of like 1 to 2 years versus even 3 years out. I think in the application layer, there is so much exciting stuff to be able to do with LLMs because and especially if we're going to an agent based world, which I think I think that's something that I believe and many of us believe, right? And in that case, you can start to really kind of look at the common forms, like the CRM is a great example. Like it exists out there, it's a very formal kind of structured data model. There's all this field mapping that goes on and all that sort of stuff. I don't know, is there a way to be able to take some of those components away, because now you can use LLMs, or you can use agents in some way to kind of reason through different things and have that set up. I don't know for sure if that's something that would work or not, right? This is why founders are a lot smarter than VCs, but it's something that's interesting, right? Where it's like there's these paradigm shifting things that you can start to do now in terms of rethinking data models, and in terms of rethinking the UI, the onboarding, like all of those experiences. And one of the things I would say that's weird in the market right now, especially with AI, is there's been a bit more of a race to build the infrastructure and the tooling, and um, and like in some cases that's important. Like the historical parallel would be like the cable, the fiber build out, right? Which now
Mhm.
gives us the internet access that we all have everywhere. But at the same time, like while that build out was happening, like there was a huge crash,
Mhm.
and you sort of like one of the things we need to remember is like there needs to be use cases for the infra to
Mhm.
get utilized, and so we've seen like kind of this amazing stuff happening on the infra side, but sort of this dearth of new companies on the application layer, and and naturally the ones that we've seen so far have been in design, have been in images, have been in video, have been in like voice dubbing and transcription and things like that, and those are all really amazing companies, and some of them have grown to incredible scale, but there's still so many other things with these like core workflows that we do every day
Mhm.
that can be connected, like connecting CRMs to to Jira, to your ticket queues, and like all those sort of things. Like there's so many of these kind of workflows that could be reimagined, that I'm hoping more and more founders, as they start to experiment with kind of LLMs more, will start to go and attack that space.
Mm. What do you think in specific, like what do you think they should attack? Let's say what would be something that you feel like the founders should build in the core workflow space in AI?
Yeah, I mean it's not something that I would say like I'm
Mhm.
smart enough to be able to tell a founder to do, right? Because in many cases, what will happen is, we have a company that we back that's still in stealth, but it's in the marketing data, and it's certainly not something that I would have said we would be we would be backing if you had told me that, right? I wouldn't
Mhm.
have said like, "Oh yeah, this is clearly, we have a thesis around this and stuff like that." It would just so happen that we met a really smart founder who kind of showed us her vision for where this would go, and and then we were like, "Wow, that makes a lot of sense. We see how that all works." And so now we're in in 2023, 2024, doing a
Mhm.
marketing data analytics company where I don't think that's something that many venture investors were particularly looking at. So um, what I would say to answer this question would be much more of, for the founders listening, like don't try and solve like kind of other problems out there. Like go through stuff either that you've experienced the pain, or that you clearly see a gap from your own sort of research that you're passionate about, and then go and explore that, because that's where like kind of the coolest ideas will happen. And as you do that exploration, because it's it's truly going to be a passion project, that's where like the VCs will get excited too, because again, like I said, we didn't have a thesis around that area, but the founders
Mhm.
showed us the vision for what was happening. But all these workflows, I mean, document ingestion, kind of the classic OCR stuff that you did from mapping a PDF and then taking that to have billing workflows put off it, or things like that. Like all of those can be improved with the use of with the use of LLMs that can kind of sort of reason through some of those areas. And so that's something that I think is like really really exciting. People should be building in that, but far be it from me to be the one to say, hey, here's like specific things that you should build, because like unfortunately,
Mhm.
that's not what we're going to
Mhm.
end up backing. We're going to end up backing founders who come and show us the vision for the future.
I want to address one of the audience question. Hi, David. So he said there are tons of AI-based applications. Most of them are built upon some base models with layers of RAGs or fine-tuned or agentic workflow. What are the major factors that help you decide whether a startup is gonna succeed or not?
Uh, so so kind of what we look at is, again, like the founder's understanding of the specific pain point. And so it's got to start from customer pain, and it's got to start from really understanding that user. and having empathy for that user. So we really we kind of that's constantly what we're looking for is like how deeply does the person understand. Even if you haven't been in their shoes, you should be able to effectively almost act like you've been in their shoes to understand that. The other aspects of it will be, everything from, again, like I mentioned, being able to talk about what are the minute steps that need to be done in the next 3 to 6 months to get an MVP out the door, or to set up, a new distribution channel, or to, ship a new product at every different stage, right? There's going to be all these things. But then also map that to the overall vision. And one thing I'll say a lot of founders do is sometimes they'll maybe nail that initial product wedge, and you'll be like, oh, I get it. Like, this is amazing. Like, I can clearly see the pain point that you're solving. I can see how it's going to do it. Like, now tell me how that's, like what's going to happen, once you do that. And then that's sometimes where some founders kind of haven't really thought that through yet. And that's an important part, because like, when you're doing a startup, you're signing yourself up for, I mean, these days, like a 10 to 14 year, 15 year journey, right? And so that's a long time to be doing something. You really want to be passionate about what you're doing. And so in that case, like, I think the way to approach that is much more around thinking through, okay, in this wedge, in this product wedge, what data do I get from the user, or about the user, or about their workflow, or something like that, that then I can use to expand into an adjacent workflow? And thinking through it really from that approach is very interesting, because then you're starting to say that, hey, the reason we're doing this wedge is because, one, there's urgent customer pain, and I can tell you about all the reasons why it's there. But also, two, there is this aspect of, once we get this data, here's the things that we can do with it, which will expand our surface area with the customer in the future to other pain points that they have. And, and then overall, this is how we could reimagine or create this new category. And by the way, those are the two frameworks I would use, is kind of like, are you creating a new category, which again, you're taking risk, you're building out for a future that nobody else necessarily sees, and you're kind of taking that timing risk, or are you reimagining existing category? And so, like when Customer in our portfolio started, right, like there was already Zendesk and Salesforce and others that existed. But the team clearly saw that some of the other platforms out there were basing everything around the ticket. The atomic data unit was the ticket. And they were just like, we think we're going to go towards a multi-channel world where, Grace is going to be, Instagram DMing, but also texting, and then also Twitter DMing about, this Nike product, for example, or something, right? And so now, instead of having each of those tickets on each of those channels be a separate thing, well, instead, what if we make the customer the atomic unit? And so then what happens is everything that, Grace is, it doesn't matter if she's sending it from WhatsApp or if she's sending it from Instagram, it will still float under the same customer data model. And what's interesting again is like, think about what that means, right? That means you've built a differentiated product that Salesforce, Zendesk, and others can't go attack because they can't mimic that data model. And so those are the type of things, like if you're going to kind of reimagine existing category, think about what's like a barrier to entry to keep those incumbents from being able to step into your space.
I wonder, okay, so I want to, since you gave the example of Nike, and why don't we chat about like one of your most like recent articles? You talk about the next big thing in consumer security. What are some trends that you've seen, and what are, like there's, you mentioned about like deep tech protection, you mentioned about like multi-party authentication. And why don't we start with like, what are the trends that you've seen in this space, and where you find are the opportunities?
Yeah. So again, like the fact that I'm writing about those areas, maybe they're not the maybe they're too well known, because again, I'm not the smartest person in the world. So I think it's like, but I in general, what I would say is that when there's these phase shifts that happen in the market, it leads to new pain points.
Mhm.
and what existed kind of originally when we first got into PCs and mobile devices and things like that was it was again a new attack surface where things could happen. And so from a consumer perspective, there were these products, right? Norton antivirus was the most example, like the most prominent example. I remember, like, we'd all have that thing. It would spin in the corner, right? And oh my God, that was the most annoying thing to upload and have going. But there were all these like different companies that were started, and then we went through. Kind of when we went from desktop to mobile, we had some new companies emerge around that.
Mhm.
When we went to like kind of having all of our personalities online, we went through new companies like kind of approaching that with either privacy, like browser privacy, or deleting your data or things like that. And these were all consumer products; they weren't necessarily enterprise products. And then like the move to cloud sort of it was a big shift, but the burn of security of the consumer security got shifted more to like Google and Microsoft and Facebook and whoever versus on the consumer ourselves. And so you kind of saw this gap where not many more consumer security companies started. Now with AI, so deep fakes are a great example. Well, Grace, how do you know you're actually talking to Shomik right
Mhm.
now? Like, I don't know. And how do I know I'm talking to Grace, right? So that's a great example of like, is there metadata that you can understand to make sure that the video is correct? Is there, that multi-party authentication example? Again, this might be a dumb idea, but the whole concept behind it is, well, imagine if I was calling you, Grace, by FaceTime or something,
Mhm.
to be able to have both of us biometrically authenticate, so then we know that, hey, this is in fact who the person is, right?
Mhm.
Now, the problem with something like that might be there might be too much friction, right? Of like we're used to
Mhm.
just picking up the phone, having someone answer, and just be able to go. But that's an interesting idea in terms of a new uh, pain point that is going to start becoming more and more prevalent because my mom, if my mom's listening, like
Mhm.
she regularly now tells me about attacks where she's heard on the news about somebody called and spoofed their kid's voice or their husband's voice or
Yeah, yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
And she's like, we need to have a code word and we need to have this thing. And
Mhm.
and so we have all those things, right? But
Mhm.
that's still not enough because like, what if someone forgets the code word or something? And
Mhm.
and so I think there's just this new vector of, okay, let's see if can we understand that the video, the voice is who we say it is. Can we on the social media side, like we mentioned Nike already. Like, what if someone put out a video where it was like, Nike shoes, but it's doing something, the person in the video wearing Nike shoes is doing something very bad, and all of a sudden that damages the brand, that damages the stock, like all that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So these are all kind of new issues that we have to kind of contend with.
When you were thinking about this specific subject, and I wonder what are something that you've done to kind of research the area, and how do you come up with the, how do you discover like this area? Um, yeah.
Yeah. So in general,
Mhm.
there's either two ways, or there's probably three ways that we discover a new area.
Mhm.
One is at the edge of our founders. So
Mhm.
we're lucky to work with some very smart people,
Mhm.
and a lot of times they will tell us like, hey, this is something you guys should be paying attention to, right? And when they tell us that, we usually listen very carefully. There's
Mhm.
also like kind of like, as I mentioned, the experts and who we're talking to. The other thing is, frankly, like we've been doing inception investing. I mean, my two colleagues, Ed and Elliot, have been doing it for 14 years now, or
Mhm.
actually even more at previous funds. But at boldstart, it's been around for 14 years. And so we just have compounded learnings from doing
Mhm.
like inception investing in enterprise software for that much time, right?
Mhm.
And as you have those learnings, you just start to like the research is kind of, it's not point in time. Like this consumer security thing wasn't like something that was like, oh, I'm going to research consumer security and put this out there. It just so happened that as I was talking with my mom and seeing what she was going through, and then
Mhm.
as I was talking with some other people, and as I started to see different, kind of deep fake videos out there and stuff like that, I was like,
Mhm.
huh, wait a second, this kind of draws me to parallels of like what we saw back in the antivirus days and then what we saw in the mobile days and stuff like that. But that doesn't come from me saying, hey, I'm going to sit down and go research this area. It just comes from like constantly reading engineering blogs, constantly, talking to customers, constantly talking to our founders, just like compounded knowledge over time that then puts us in the kind of so-called prepared mind state to be able to kind of look into some of these areas when the opportunity arises.
I wonder, like a lot of the listeners are emerging people, like emerging GPLPs and like, or just like, like angel investors or like people who are operators who are, you know, investing. And I wonder, when you are thinking about creating your own thesis, what are some advice for that? And like, I want to, maybe this is like a really random question, but I saw that you mentioned like you worked on a failed startup. What were some lessons that you've learned from, failing? Because technically most companies fail, and um I think people don't really talk about the lessons there. Like people constantly talk about, here's why we're winning, but I wonder if there's any lessons that kind of like shape you into how you're thinking about investing today.
Yeah, so there was maybe two questions there. So I'll answer the failure one first, and then maybe we could go back to the other one. But
Okay.
so to your point on the failure side, like, I mean, the startup is like the least of my failures, right? It's like I've failed like so many times. It's hard to say, and the failure can come in so many different ways, right? Could come from in my case as a VC, like passing on a company that and ended up doing quite well. It could be that not realizing the key issues that could have helped a company that we've invested in and the founders that we had invested in to kind of adjust the business earlier to put them on a solid footing. There's all these sort of areas that you're kind of constantly failing, right? Like like every day there's like failures that are happening. Like you didn't reach out to a customer early enough, and so they already signed up with somebody else, and now the founder's asking you for an intro, and you should have thought about, hey, I should have reached out to this customer a lot sooner. So those things I think are just always things that you can learn from, and that's the great thing I think about Silicon Valley is just people here truly embrace failure. They truly embrace kind of as long as you learn from them that idea. And so for the startup, the biggest thing that the biggest learning I had was a lot about culture, and it was a lot about just like how to work with others, how to bring out the best of the ability in folks, and there were a lot of mistakes that we made in that sort of vein. But now, because of those mistakes, when I see it happening with the founders that I'm fortunate to partner with, and at boldstart that the rest of our team is fortunate to partner with, like hopefully we can call those out because of the fact that we've lived those experiences and seen it firsthand, and frankly, again, it's all this comes back to the people. Like the funniest thing is, so what kills startups 100% is premature scaling. It doesn't matter what stage. You could have 100 million of ARR, but if you prematurely scale for like a billion of ARR, you're burning too much cash. You may fall out of product market fit because you start to build features and features and features, and you're not doing that iteratively with customers, right? And so it's this premature scaling is something that constantly happens. But why does premature scaling lead to failure? And that's the interesting part, is because the culture changes. Because when you prematurely scale and you're building for that $1 billion company, that means you're hiring the people who've done that stage before. And those people are like, well, hey, listen, we got to scale. So let's go hire. Like, we need RevOps, and we need sales engineers, and we need this and that. And all of a sudden, all these pieces start to go in. But culturally, what does culture mean? It's how decisions get made, right? When an individual is faced with a critical decision, do they know what to do in that point in time? And do they have the ability to make that decision, right? Or do they have to centralize? Do they have to go back and report to somebody else to check? And how do they know that difference? That gets exponentially harder the more nodes you add to that network. The more you hire, it gets harder and harder and harder. And so that's why premature scaling leads to failure, is because of the fact that like all these cultural components change. because you're adding
Mhm.
more nodes, and it's really hard to keep that decision making process consistent with everybody that is adding there, especially if they haven't had the context even of 3 months ago, right? Because they just
Mhm.
got hired, and there's a new batch of 50 people starting, on the same day and stuff like that. So,
Mhm.
so I think that's something where founders should really be aware of that. That is the most common thing that we see that unfortunately leads to startups not succeeding, but also it is something that you can correct.
I think in terms of scaling that, as a very early stage, as like the first line of code, I don't know how like early the problem of scaling is going to happen. As like maybe people were product building at the first like three people in the company or something. What are some earlier sign you feel like you would pay more attention to? Looking at from the hindsight from the very early stage.
Yeah, I mean, you actually, ironically, you see it actually at the early stage too, because like that exponential amount is just happening much quicker. Because when you go from one to
Mhm.
two, you just doubled the size of the team, right?
Mhm.
And so two to four, you just doubled again, right? So all of a sudden,
Mhm.
like the interactive nodes like can expand really quickly. And the way that you can start to see if that's not working is basically if decision cycles and speed
Mhm.
of changing and iterating with as you get customer insights, if that slows, because then that starts to mean that you're getting bogged down in process versus the actual just
Mhm.
ship a product, get it into people's hands, and iterate with them, right? And so so that's actually the most common thing that we see is. It ironically still is premature scaling. It just
Mhm.
happens in a different way. It's not maybe at the same scale that we talked about, but it's just like, hey, maybe you didn't need to hire a product manager, because right now you still need the team to just be, everyone needs to be a product manager essentially. Like they need to all be
Mhm.
in front of customers, learning from them and shipping really fast, versus having somebody centralized to take those inputs. And so yeah, I mean it's again, it's all just like this people analysis of like, okay,
Mhm.
if something's not working, right? We had this with a company, where the sales were not coming in as expected,
Mhm.
and we're sort of like, like what's happening? And then as we started to dig in, we were just like, oh, like the engineers don't have visibility into the sales pipeline. And why is that a problem?
Mhm.
Well, because this happens to be a technical product, and the customers, they have technical things that they need, right? Technical
Mhm.
features or implementation asks or stuff like that. And if the engineers don't have visibility into that, well, then how can they build they're just going out and building the product and doing what the PM says, right? But they
Mhm.
don't have that customer empathy of like, wow, the customer's having a really hard challenge of implementing this in their systems. Okay, well, actually, that should probably be priority number one. That if we fixed, we'd be able to unlock this whole pipeline, right? So those sort of things
Mhm.
of like, and that constantly happens at each level of scale. Like it happens
Mhm.
when you're at 10 people, it happens when you're at 20, it happens when you're at 50, and it just keeps on happening over and over, where you basically have to go in and you retrench. And you saw this, by the way, most kind of publicly, I would say, during COVID, where all the companies overhired because
Mhm.
demand was also scaling. So you sort of needed to. Growth was really high, demand was scaling, so you need to scale the team. And then you saw like all these same companies do a bunch of layoffs, and when you do those layoffs, what you're trying to do is you're trying to reset the organization too, to just kind of say like, okay, wait, how do we get back to really kind of keeping everyone close to what's most important, the most important goals, and so you need to rebuild all those organizational systems and the communication channels and all this sort of stuff. And so I think it's a really challenging time. But you mentioned Shopify. Like I just encourage everyone to kind of look at Shopify as a great example of like, wow, what amazing growth, right? 2021,
Mhm.
everyone's sitting at home, not going anywhere. What are you going to buy? You're going to buy online goods. So boom, like it goes off like a rocket ship. They hire, they're shipping products, they're buying a delivery company, they're doing all this sort of stuff, right? They're moving into logistics. And then they realize, we overshot. In
Mhm.
fact, like yes, the trend did accelerate, and still the growth curve is the same, but like that growth curve didn't inflect that much. That growth curve
Mhm.
is still the same way, and so now we're coming back onto the steady state growth curve. And so all those sort of things, those made sense when like you were growing at that scale and stuff, but now you have to rethink it. And so you see like Shopify goes in, does layoffs, restructures the team, sells off that logistics asset that they bought. All really tough decisions, but they made it so then they can start to now be in a great position where I think that business is going to continue to do quite well in the future.
Mm, when you are thinking about like the diligencing process for the companies that you find interesting, can you walk us through like, from how you found a company to evaluating it? I have some sub question in that sector, which is since I feel like investing in the very early stage, like you said, like it's about the team. Would you how do you evaluate the team's past experience? Because I've seen two type of founders. One of these are like maybe like the PhD from somewhere that have like a really amazing technology, but they probably lack of like the industry network or just sales experience. And then there's like these type of people who are industry veterans. Even when I ask my friends who are like amazing scientists, they told me you should pick the network people, which is like, the people who are actually able to have like domain network that are able to execute the selling piece. Even like maybe the tier two product, if they have a tier one sales team, that's better. But just I wonder what's your perspective after seeing so many companies in the very early stage to go scale?
Yeah, I mean, so first on the sales example, I'll just say like that's everyone will have opinions on that.
Mhm.
Domain expertise in sales, especially for like kind of the early hires, I would say it really depends on the end market, but most of the time is actually less relevant than getting someone who is just is able to embrace the chaos of early stage. Because you can get
Mm,
someone who has a ton of domain expertise. They've sold Salesforce, for the past 5 years, and they've been the best seller in the world, right?
mhm,
And so now they're going to your new CRM company, and you're just like, oh my God, it's great. They already have the Rolodex. They're going to call up people. They're going to be able to talk about our solution, all that sort of stuff. Except that, you know, did you test them on their ability to not have their own CRM? Right?
mhm, mhm,
Because it's you're still using Google Sheets. Did you test them on not having marketing leads coming in and MQLs and stuff, right? And they're just going to have to go and outbound on their own. Did you test them on all those sort of things? If you didn't, it doesn't matter if they have the best domain expertise in the world. They're still going to fail in this position. And so I think that's one thing of like, in general, overweighting on domain expertise can actually be it can feel nice because you feel like, oh, I found this person, but in fact, like that's not actually, you need to kind of diligence the person more than the domain expertise. And I think that same thing goes, as we evaluate founders, is we want people who understand the pain point very deeply.
mhm,
But I can tell you, like, for example, my colleague Ellen, like, I strongly doubt that there's a company in the world that she couldn't figure out, like, or a
mhm.
category. Like, she's just someone who can go in, dive in, research companies, research pain points, stuff like that, and understand it very deeply. And so, while maybe if Ellen were to one day start a company or something, like, it may not be in so-called like her domain expertise, but like knowing her as someone that we do, like, it's like, well, she's just very smart, she would figure it out, right? And so I think, again, it's like kind of it's hard to say because it's like everyone will do it differently. Every VC fund will have a different approach, but we really, really care about kind of the intangibles, right? Like, is this person going to break through walls to go and figure things out? Are they afraid? Like, Paul Graham has the do things that don't scale, right? Like, how are they thinking about doing those things that don't scale? Will they go and fly out to a customer and just sit outside their office and be like, you know what? I'm going to help you implement this, and you guys need to see this, right? Kind of those sort of intangibles are actually what make great companies versus getting someone who understands every aspect of a certain market but doesn't have those same skill sets.
Totally. I have like a piggyback question around that. So you mentioned like there's your colleague that you probably know really well, but I feel like for the earlier stage founders, like you can't really know everybody really well, although you can maybe check like call their like past coworker or something. But I feel like the data point is like a lot less than if you know someone really well. How do you quickly judge um if someone's gonna make it in like very let's say like three things that you feel like are matters the most?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it just depends on like their ability to respond to our questions, the way that they. So, for example, we always ask companies for a blurb,
Mhm.
like a paragraph describing what they do, and we're usually just like we'll tell them, hey, send something that you would send to a customer because we're actually going to use this for a customer intro, and you can tell a lot from if somebody sends you, you know, an essay,
Mhm.
or if they send you something that's very targeted, or if they maybe even ask you a question. Oh, hey, by the way, like what when you say potential customer, like what does that mean? What do you mean? Is it going to be a CTO? Is it going to be a VP Eng? Is it going to be a like an individual engineer? Right, like that sort of thing. We're looking at because we're starting to understand how that founder thinks. Right, by those questions, by the way that they phrase things, by the way they do it, we're kind of starting to understand a lot how they think, and so we can kind of diagnose a lot of these things in a frankly short period of time because this is what
Mhm.
we all do all day long, and so we can start to look at that, but then of course like references and all of those are quite important, and normally like in enterprise software especially it's a small ecosystem, even though it's a large market, but it's
Mhm.
a small ecosystem, and so in the end, like you're still able to get a lot from back channel references and things like that of like previous colleagues, maybe previous board members even of different companies and stuff like that. The interesting thing is not to you can't also overweight one bad reference. Because sometimes you'll get a bad reference and it just so happens that, just like in any case, there's people that just didn't get along,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean that that person actually has a very clear, kind of reason of why that happened. And so sometimes, like if anything, the one of the mistakes that I've done is like maybe I'll over-index on someone saying a bad reference. And then just be like, oh, okay, like I don't know how like the founder would get around that or something, right? But in reality, maybe if the fact that like they never finished a project at their previous job or something like that, maybe that actually means they'd be a great founder because they didn't want to go and do this direction of what they were being told to do and stuff like that. They wanted to go and where they saw the pain point and what they needed to solve, and so hence why they're starting this business, right? So that may be a bad reference on one hand and be like, oh, we would never hire and work with them again. Flip side, that might actually make them a really good founder. So there's all these sort of things that you have to kind of take into account as you're doing it. It's a blend of science and art, right? Which is the fun part.
I wonder what are things that I want to like switch gear a little bit. I wonder like how do you like if you're like an emerging manager, how do you come up with like a thesis in the domain of SaaS security and just like overall in the enterprise space? Because it sounds like I feel like after like having some amazing guests on our show, like I feel like a lot of people are focusing on like things that you measure like either foundational model in the AI space or any particular sector that's interesting in AI. What are things that you feel like people are either not looking at or you feel like are still very undervalued? Like, how do they create a thesis in the SaaS space if they are like an emerging manager?
So I think from the emerging manager perspective, it's much more of like one, what are you passionate about?
Mhm.
All of the team at boldstart, we live and breathe enterprise software. So like when you see our Slacks on the
Mhm.
weekends, we're literally sending like speaking of deep fakes, we'll send like did you see this deep fake thing that Microsoft did? Did you see this research paper that came out about identifying this sort of stuff? Like we'll be like Figma had put out a thing about scaling their Postgres clusters, right? And it was a type of database, and so that's what we read on the weekends, right? We are just like, oh,
Mhm.
this is pretty interesting. Like everyone should
Mhm.
read this, right? So I think like one from an emerging manager perspective, you want to be passionate about whatever it is you're doing, and so as you
Mhm.
come to a thesis, it should be something that you like it doesn't even feel like work. Like you just live and breathe it, right? Because that's the way that you're going to do it. And by the way, if you're doing that from a generalist perspective, that probably means that you're just like someone who enjoys reading about a lot of things, right? You enjoy reading about biology, and then you also enjoy reading about, consumer, and you enjoy, and so maybe that's also how you form your thesis of, hey, I'm just going to be a generalist, but I really care about founders who can show me the way moving forward, right? But in terms of like finding white space, like again, it's so there's some funds, right? USV is very thesis driven. They'll publish their thesis. They do deep research. Emergence, I think, similarly publishes pieces that have deep research, stuff like that. At boldstart, like we do a blend. Sure, I put out that consumer security piece, right? Or like we've talked about AI security before, or we've talked about pain points around Kubernetes or whatever, right? So sometimes we'll have like something very specific that will say, oh, okay, this is something we're looking for or interested in or whatever. But a lot of times it just comes from, we didn't know anything about the category, but we saw a founder that was amazing. And always keeping that room to be curious and meet someone who has a high potential idea, who's a high potential person and has an amazing idea, that can lead to some very exciting things. So I think that's like where I would say undervalued. It's like, this whole concept around AI, it is a big paradigm shifting thing. At the same time, I think there's there's not enough attention being paid to one, the capital intensity of some of these businesses and what the steady state ecosystem looks like. And when there's this much capital abundance and this many kind of foundation model players are popping up every day, that just erodes the moat and the even at scale kind of margins of the business. And so the amount of capital too that you have to put into these businesses is quite insane. So like you're also factoring in dilution, stock-based compensation, like all these sort of things that can affect the return to not only the VCs, but also to the founders and the employees, right? In terms of what they make. And so I think that's something where in general, like SF in particular has a huge filter bubble. And I would, as someone who's lived in New York and LA and Chicago and Pittsburgh, like in a bunch of different areas, I would just say like, it's amazing to be in the Bay Area because you get to see everything that's happening around and have just amazing conversations. The flip side is though, we also need to kind of be aware and take a step back of like sometimes, when we're talking, for the 20th time about open source versus proprietary models, most of the world still doesn't care. And so like, so if we're truly trying to affect, the rest of the world, like, OpenAI started when nobody was really kind of experimenting with AI that much, right? In the same way, like we had landed on deep learning and neural networks, and like that was the approach that we were going for. And then OpenAI did this, and now everyone's doing that, right? Like, what's the next thing that like you want to be focused on, or how can you use that current technology to change the experiences, the workflows, the lives of the users and current customers out there?
Mm, I love that. Okay, so let's talk about like pipelines. How do you own like your deal sourcing pipeline? Like how do you kind of creating unfair advantage for yourself? Either, maybe every single customer in the security space, or, you are from a certain circle of like people that you have worked with that kind of like is creating billion-dollar company in the space. Like what are things that you would do to kind of like own a particular deal sourcing area?
Yeah, I mean, it always comes to a network approach, and so so one, it's just about like kind of again, our founders are some of the smartest people, and so if we can continue finding other smart founders, they will lead us to others that will continue to back. As our founders also become successful and they start angel investing themselves, they start to bring stuff in. We also know angel investors from kind of successful companies that have done well or various ways that also kind of know us and know how we approach things and send us stuff. Other VC funds. And then, frankly, there's also just things like, my colleague Ed has a What's Hot in IT newsletter that is read by pretty much like everybody in the enterprise ecosystem, it feels like. So he gets stuff through there. Like I have a podcast called Software Snack Bites where like, there's people that come in through there randomly. Like, we put out a random blog post on consumer security. We get some people coming back to us saying, hey, we're excited. We're building in this area, right? Like there's so many different ways. I would just say like, it's kind of like, there's no, it's sort of similar to marketing. Like you can't, if you just did one thing, you would saturate that. So you kind of almost have to do one channel for a little bit, and then kind of now start to kind of utilize another channel, and then go back to the previous channel, and so on and so forth. And over time, what that leads to is this sort of various ways of meeting new founders that you're excited about.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Shomik, for coming on the show today. Why don't we end with like a 1 minute fair round? What's your favorite book?
Favorite book? Well, I think, Poor Charlie's Almanac, I would say, is probably my favorite book.
That's a great book. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Wow, that's a great question. I would probably say Mark Leonard from Constellation Software.
Uh, who made the biggest impact in your career?
In my career, I would say my colleague Ed Sim. To date, he's taught me a whole lot about venture investing. And one thing I didn't mention is he has this thing called the three C's, and it's know when to chill, cheer, or challenge. And that's something that constantly I find myself in every day. Is like, should I be chilling, cheering, or challenging in this scenario?
Oh my God. Uh, where can we find you outside of work?
I love hiking. In fact, like that's like my number one thing. So if anybody ever wants to hang out and wants to go for a walk or a hike, that is the way to do it. I will never say no. In fact, we had, unfortunately I wasn't able to attend, but we had organized a founder rucking, which is where you wear a heavy weight on your backpack, and it was a bunch of founders and VCs getting together and walking around in San Francisco. So always up to be outdoors and just experience the outdoors.
What's your content diet look like?
My content diet. It's a blend of basically my Twitter feed of which has been curated over many years, that kind of sends interesting stuff, interesting articles or interesting podcasts, and then frankly just like the people I get to talk to on a daily basis. So the founders, my colleagues, other VCs, customers, things like that, where they constantly just have me learning more and more.
Amazing, Shomik. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Grace, thank you so much for having me on. I love that the books are in the background too, so I think everyone should read the books that you
Oh
publish,
my
and it's really
God.
cool to see what you're doing. So,
Oh no, we need to also at the end give your like podcast a plug again.
it's called Software Snack Bites. You can find it on YouTube, Apple, kind of Spotify, and yeah, it's a fun deep dive into enterprise software. So we have enterprise execs, we have founders, we have deep dives into tech, we have deep dives into private companies. Like it's a blend of all the above.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Let me
Yeah.
quickly end stream.